The bridge at Vegel. The detonation cord felt like a dead snake in Jake McNiece's hands, waterlogged, frayed at the ends, and about as reliable as a politician's promise. 300 yards behind him, the Wilhelmina Canal Bridge stretched across the dark water like a stone finger pointing straight into the heart of the 101st Airborne's positions. If that bridge stayed intact until dawn, German armor would roll across it and turn Operation Market Garden into the biggest Allied disaster since Dieppe. McNiece squinted at his watch through the September rain. 2100 hours. 6 hours until the panzer column was expected to punch through Vegel, and his demolition setup looked like something a recruit might jury-rig during his first week of training. The TNT satchels scattered around the bridge's foundation were soaked from their botched night drop. Half the filthy 13 were missing somewhere in the flooded polders beyond the village, and his radio had been dead since the C-47 took flak over the drop zone. The mission brief had made it sound clean enough, a textbook bridge demolition to cut German supply lines during the push north. Drop behind enemy lines, rig the crossing with satchel charges, blow it sky high, and disappear into the Dutch countryside before dawn. But the transport had scattered his men across 3 miles of enemy territory, and when McNiece finally regrouped with Corporal Bowers and Private Ragsman near the target, they discovered that Murphy's Law had taken up permanent residence in their gear. "Sarge, this whole setup's cursed," Bowers muttered from his position behind the stone abutment, a soggy block of TNT balanced in his lap like a wet infant. "The primers are shot, the main charge won't hold together, and that cord's been dragged through every puddle between here and Eindhoven." McNiece ran his thumb along the exposed copper strands of the detonation cord, feeling the places where the waterproof casing had torn away during their rough landing. 3 years of blowing up German infrastructure from Sicily to Normandy had taught him that demolitions were about precision, timing, and respect for the physics of high explosives. What they weren't about was prayer and wishful thinking, but tonight those seemed to be his primary tools. "We'll make it work," he said, more to convince himself than his men. "Germans want this bridge. We're going to make sure they can't have it." The truth sat heavier in his gut. McNiece had lost contact with battalions 6 hours ago, and for all he knew, the entire Market Garden offensive was collapsing around them. The panzer column might never show up, or it might already be rolling through Vegel while they crouched in the mud playing with broken explosives. But his squad was counting on him to make the call, and 3 years of combat had taught him that hesitation killed more paratroopers than enemy bullets. Through the rain, he could see shadows moving in the village square, German infantry, checking doorways and alley mouths with the methodical patience of veterans who knew the Americans were close. Their machine gunner had positioned himself to cover the bridge approaches, which meant any attempt to finish the demolition setup would happen under direct fire. McNiece counted 8 men, moving in pairs, their coal scuttle helmets silhouetted against the church tower like gargoyles come to life. "They're not just passing through," Ragsman whispered, watching the patrol establish defensive positions. "They're securing the crossing for something big." McNiece studied the German positions and felt the familiar cold certainty that came with impossible choices. The detonation cord was too damaged to guarantee a clean blast from safe distance. Someone would have to stay close to the charges, manually triggering the explosion with a backup primer, which meant dying in the blast or facing machine gun fire in the open. Either way, the mathematics didn't look promising. From his crouched position near the canal, McNiece could see Lieutenant Harrison's company dug in along the eastern approach to Vegel, their foxholes barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Those men were counting on this bridge coming down before German armor could use it as a highway into their positions. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like wet wool, familiar and suffocating. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The backup primer felt like a small metal prayer in McNiece's breast pocket as he studied the bridge's stone foundation through his field glasses. The device would detonate the charges manually, but it required physical contact with the TNT and carried a 2-minute delay, long enough for someone to sprint clear if they were lucky, fast, and not under machine gun fire from 3 directions. "Sarge, we could wait for the rest of the squad to show up," Bowers suggested, his voice carrying the thin hope of a man who knew they were probably scattered across half of Holland by now. "Maybe try to raise battalion on the radio again." McNiece lowered his glasses and looked at his corporal. Really looked at him. Bowers had jumped into Sicily with the 82nd, fought through Anzio, and landed in Normandy without so much as a scratch. But tonight, crouched behind a Dutch bridge with broken gear and bad options, he looked like what he was. A 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa who'd signed up to fight fascists and ended up playing demolition roulette in the dark. "Radio's been dead since we hit the ground," McNiece said quietly. "And if the Germans are setting up defensive positions, it means their armor's coming whether we're ready or not." The sound of vehicles rumbling in the distance punctuated his point. Trucks, maybe tanks, still miles away but getting closer. McNiece had heard that sound too many times in Italy and France. It was the sound of Wehrmacht units moving with purpose, not the random traffic of retreat or repositioning. Something was coming down that road, and it wanted the bridge intact. Ragsman appeared from his scouting position near the village edge, low-crawling through the wet grass, with news written across his face like a telegram nobody wanted to read. "Sarge, there's more Germans moving up from the south. Looks like a full company, maybe more. They're setting up roadblocks on both approaches to the canal." McNiece absorbed this information with the grim acceptance of a man who'd learned to read bad tactical situations like weather reports. The Germans weren't just securing the bridge. They were creating a corridor for something important enough to risk exposing an entire company to Allied airstrikes come daylight. Tank column, supply convoy, or reinforcements heading north to smash the airborne corridor before it could consolidate. "How long before they reach the bridge?" he asked. "Hour, maybe 2 if they're being careful about mines." McNiece nodded and returned his attention to the frayed detonation cord. 2 hours to repair damaged equipment, position charges, and blow a bridge under the noses of an entrenched enemy force. In training, they'd been given half a day for similar demolitions, with perfect equipment and no one shooting at them. But training had never accounted for the particular chaos of Market Garden's scattered drops, waterlogged gear, and the reality that half his men were missing somewhere in the Dutch countryside. From his position, McNiece could see the church tower where he'd spotted muzzle flashes earlier, probably a sniper or forward observer with a good view of the bridge approaches. The machine gun nest controlled the main crossing, while rifle squads had positioned themselves to cover the flanks. It was a textbook defensive setup, the kind that would shred anyone trying to approach the bridge foundation where the charges needed to go. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" Bowers asked, though his expression suggested he already knew and wasn't happy about it. McNiece fingered the backup primer and considered his options. The manual detonation meant someone had to stay with the charges until the last possible moment, a suicide mission unless they could create enough distraction to mask the approach and withdrawal. But even if they managed that miracle, there was no guarantee the water-damaged TNT would generate enough force to drop the center span. "I'm thinking we do our job," McNiece said finally. "Germans want this crossing, we make sure they can't have it. Simple as that. But nothing about the situation was simple. The mathematics of demolitions required precision, and precision required time they didn't have, equipment that wasn't broken, and conditions that didn't involve machine guns and veteran infantry. McNiece had improvised his way through 3 years of European combat, but tonight felt different, more personal, more final. In the distance, the sound of German vehicles grew closer, punctuated by the occasional bark of orders in a language that sounded like machinery breaking. Time was running out for the scattered paratroopers of the 101st, for the success of Market Garden, and for the men crouched in the mud beside the Wilhelmina Canal with broken equipment and impossible orders. The news came from a runner who materialized out of the darkness like a ghost with bad tidings. Private Collins from Harrison's company, his uniform torn and muddy, his rifle missing its stock. He'd crawled 200 yards through German positions to reach McNiece's improvised command post behind the bridge abutment. "Lieutenant Harrison's compliments, sir, but the situation's gone to hell," Collins whispered, his breathing ragged from the sprint across no man's land. "German armor hit our positions on the eastern approach an hour ago. We're falling back to secondary positions, but they're pushing hard toward Wegel." McNiece absorbed this information with the cold clarity that came with disaster. If Harrison's company was already engaged, the Panzer Column wasn't hours away. It was here, now, grinding through Dutch villages and farmland toward the canal crossing. The bridge demolition had transformed from a textbook operation into the difference between organized withdrawal and complete collapse. "How many tanks?" he asked. "Couldn't get an accurate count," Collins replied. "At least a company, maybe more. Panzers and infantry moving coordinated. They hit us right at dawn, knew exactly where we were dug in." Bowers and Ragsman exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the tactical situation. German armor, supported infantry, coordinated attack, all the elements of a major push designed to crack the airborne corridor and roll up Market Garden from the flanks. And standing between that steamroller and the scattered positions of the 101st was one damaged bridge and 3 paratroopers with waterlogged explosives. McNiece studied the bridge's stone foundation through his field glasses, calculating angles, blast patterns, and the amount of TNT required to drop a span into 40 feet of canal water. The manual he'd memorized during training called for precise placement of charges at the bridge's structural weak points, coordinated detonation from safe distance, and backup systems in case of primary failure. What he had was soggy TNT, frayed detonation cord, and a backup primer that required someone to light the fuse while German machine guns controlled every approach. "Sarge, we could fall back with Harrison's company," Ragsman suggested, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a man who'd done the math and didn't like the results. "Regroup, try to stop them somewhere else." But McNiece knew there wasn't anywhere else. The canal crossing represented the natural choke point where a small force with the right explosives could stop an armored column. Fall back, and the Germans would have a clear highway into the heart of the airborne positions. The scattered companies of the 101st would be rolled up piecemeal, Market Garden would collapse, and the war would drag on for months longer. "We're not falling back," he said quietly. "This bridge comes down tonight, one way or another." The sound of tracked vehicles had grown closer, punctuated by the distinctive whine of German tank transmissions and the mechanical clatter of road wheels on cobblestones. McNiece had heard those sounds in Sicily, at Anzio, and during the breakout from Normandy. It was the sound of Wehrmacht armor moving with confidence, crushing resistance and grinding forward toward objectives that had been marked on maps in distant headquarters. Collins shifted nervously, checking his watch against the approaching dawn. "Lieutenant Harrison said to tell you he'll try to hold the eastern positions as long as possible, but he can't guarantee more than an hour, maybe 2 if the Germans stop to consolidate." McNiece nodded, already calculating the timeline in his head. 1 hour to repair the detonation system, position the charges correctly, and create enough distraction to mask the final approach. 2 hours if they were lucky, and the German commander decided to probe defenses instead of smashing through them. Either way, the window was closing fast. From his position behind the abutment, McNiece could see muzzle flashes beginning to sparkle along the eastern horizon as Harrison's company engaged the advancing armor. The sound of tank guns echoed across the flat Dutch landscape, punctuated by the stutter of machine guns and the occasional crack of rifle fire. It was the sound of the 101st Airborne selling time with blood, buying precious minutes for a demolition that might not even work. "What are your orders, Sarge?" Bowers asked, though his expression suggested he'd already guessed the answer. McNiece fingered the backup primer and looked at the bridge that stood between German armor and the scattered positions of his fellow paratroopers. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and personal. Someone had to stay with the charges. Someone had to light the fuse. Someone had to make sure the bridge came down, regardless of the cost. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The TNT satchel felt heavier than it should have as McNiece slung it across his shoulder and checked the backup primer one final time. 2 minutes from activation to detonation, enough time for a man to sprint clear if he was fast, lucky, and didn't catch a bullet while crossing open ground under machine gun fire. The mathematics of survival weren't encouraging. "Sarge, let me do it," Bowers said, his voice carrying the desperate loyalty of a man who'd followed McNiece through 3 campaigns. "You've got more experience reading the blast patterns. If something goes wrong, experience won't matter," McNiece interrupted, coiling the frayed detonation cord around his wrist like a rosary made of copper and desperation. "I need you and Ragsman to create noise on the north approach. Draw their attention away from the foundation." The German machine gun position had excellent fields of fire across the bridge deck, while rifle squads controlled both flanks from prepared positions in the village. McNiece had studied the defensive setup through his field glasses and recognized the handiwork of veterans, overlapping fields of fire, clear escape routes, and backup positions already prepared. These weren't the green recruits they'd faced in Normandy. These were experienced Wehrmacht infantry who knew their business. Bowers grabbed McNiece's sleeve, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "This is suicide. You can't repair that cord under fire, and there's no cover on the bridge deck. Let's wait for more of the squad to show up. Try a different approach." "There is no different approach," McNiece replied, checking his .45 and feeling for the grenades on his webbing. "And there's no time. Harrison's company is getting chewed up out there, buying us minutes we can't waste." The sound of tank guns had grown closer, their flat crack echoing across the canal as German armor ground forward through the Dutch countryside. McNiece could see muzzle flashes sparkling along the eastern horizon where the 101st Airborne was trading space for time, falling back from position to position while Wehrmacht infantry followed up the armored spearhead. Ragsman appeared from his observation post near the village edge, his face grim with fresh intelligence. "German engineers are moving up behind their infantry. They've got bridging equipment, portable spans. Even if we blow the main crossing, they'll have it replaced in a few hours." McNiece absorbed this news with the fatalistic acceptance of a man who'd learned that war rarely offered clean solutions to tactical problems. Blow the bridge, and the Germans would bridge it. Leave it intact, and their armor would roll straight into the heart of the airborne positions. Either way, the 101st was running out of options and time. But a few hours might be enough. A few hours for scattered companies to consolidate, for reinforcements to arrive, for Allied air power to intervene once the weather cleared. In 3 years of European combat, McNiece had learned that battles were often won by whoever could hang on for one more hour, survive one more German assault, hold one more critical piece of ground. "Then we make those hours count," he said, slinging the TNT satchel higher on his shoulder. "Give me 10 minutes to reach the foundation, then start your diversion. Make it loud, make it convincing, and don't stop until you hear the bang." The approach to the bridge foundation would require crawling across 50 yards of open ground under direct observation from the German machine gun nest. McNiece had made similar approaches in Italy and France, but never with damaged equipment, and never with the knowledge that the entire success of Market Garden might depend on one improvised demolition in the darkness. Bowers and Ragsman took their positions for the diversion, preparing to create enough noise and muzzle flashes to draw German attention away from the bridge foundation. It was a desperate gambit that would expose them to concentrated fire from prepared positions, but it was the only chance McNiece had of reaching the charges alive. "See you on the other side, Sarge," Bowers called softly, his voice carrying the rough affection of men who'd shared foxholes from Sicily to Holland. McNiece nodded and began his crawl toward the bridge foundation, the TNT satchel dragging behind him like a deadly anchor. The backup primer felt warm in his breast pocket, and the frayed detonation cord uncoiled in his wake like a trail of broken promises. 50 yards of open ground, 2 minutes to rig the charges, and a sprint to safety that would happen under direct fire. The German machine gun opened up as he reached the halfway point, its distinctive buzzsaw chatter echoing off the stone bridge supports. But the gunner was firing at Bowers and Ragsman's diversion, spraying the village approaches rather than the bridge deck itself. McNiece pressed himself against the cold stone and felt the TNT satchel's reassuring weight. Enough explosive power to drop the center span, if he could place it correctly, and trigger it before German infantry stormed his position. The backup primer clicked into place with a sound like breaking glass, and McNiece started counting seconds in his head while bullets whined overhead like mechanical wasps. The stone bridge foundation offered no cover from the German positions, but the diversion had worked. Rifle fire was concentrated on the village approaches where Bowers and Ragsman were making noise, not on the bridge itself. At 30 seconds, McNiece heard jackboots on cobblestones as enemy infantry moved to reinforce their positions. At 60 seconds, the machine gun swung toward the bridge, searching for targets. At 90 seconds, he realized the terrible truth that would haunt his dreams for decades. The water-damaged TNT might not generate enough blast to drop the span completely. The charges were positioned correctly. The primer was armed, but the soggy explosives looked more like wet cardboard than the precision demolition materials he'd trained with at Fort Benning. If the blast was insufficient, the bridge would suffer cosmetic damage while remaining structurally intact, and German armor would still have its highway into the heart of the 101st's positions. McNiece crouched beside the satchel charges and made a decision that contradicted every regulation, every safety protocol, and every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed in 3 years of combat. Instead of retreating to minimum safe distance, he would stay with the charges and manually adjust the blast if necessary, using his own body weight to focus the explosion downward into the bridge's structural supports. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A concentrated blast from close range might compensate for the water-damaged explosives, but it would also kill anyone within 50 feet of the detonation. McNiece would have perhaps 30 seconds after the primer activated to make his choice. Sprint for safety and hope the charges were sufficient, or stay and guarantee the bridge came down at the cost of his own life. At 100 seconds, German voices shouted from both ends of the bridge as enemy infantry realized what was happening. At 110 seconds, McNiece heard the distinctive whine of tank transmissions approaching from the east. Armor moving fast, trying to secure the crossing before it could be destroyed. At 115 seconds, he closed his eyes and made peace with mathematics that offered no good options. The explosion lifted him off the bridge deck and threw him into the canal like a rag doll hurled by an angry god. The blast wave hammered his chest, ruptured his eardrums, and filled his world with orange fire and falling stone. When he surfaced, gasping and deaf, the center span of the Wilhelmina Canal Bridge was settling into the dark water like a broken promise fulfilled. But McNiece's survival came with a terrible secret he would never fully share with military historians or Medal of Honor recommendations. In those final seconds before the blast, he had tried to run, had actually started sprinting towards safety before stumbling and falling back into the kill radius. The explosion that dropped the bridge and saved the 101st positions had been triggered by accident, not by the heroic sacrifice that would later appear in citations and unit histories. The cold canal water revived his hearing enough to catch the sound of German tanks grinding to a halt on the far bank, their route to Wegel effectively severed until engineers could span the gap. Voices shouted in frustration across the destroyed crossing, while McNiece floated in the darkness, clutching debris and trying to process the gap between what had actually happened and what others would later believe. Bowers and Ragsman found him downstream an hour later, half drowned and still clutching fragments of the detonation cord like a lifeline to sanity. They pulled him from the water without questions, understanding instinctively that some truths were too complicated for after-action reports, or the clean narratives that would later transform the night into legend. "Bridge is down, Sarge," Bowers said simply, wrapping McNiece in a borrowed field jacket. "Jerry armor is stacked up on the far bank with nowhere to go. Harrison's company is reforming on the secondary positions." McNiece nodded, unable to speak about the 30 seconds when fear had nearly overridden duty, when the legend that would follow him for decades had been born from stumbling rather than heroism. The official reports would describe a textbook demolition executed under extreme conditions by a non-commissioned officer who exemplified the fighting spirit of the American paratrooper. The truth was messier, more human, and infinitely heavier. McNiece had completed the mission, saved countless lives, and helped preserve the Market Garden corridor through another crucial night. But he would carry the knowledge that his most celebrated action had been triggered by accident, by falling when he meant to run, by survival instincts that had momentarily overridden the duty that defined him. In the growing dawn light, German engineers were already surveying the destroyed bridge, preparing temporary spans that would restore the crossing within hours. But those hours had been bought with water-damaged TNT, frayed detonation cord, and one demolition NCO's accidental heroism in the darkness beside the Wilhelmina Canal. The after-action report reduced the entire night to 3 clean sentences. Bridge destroyed as ordered, enemy advance delayed, no friendly casualties. Lieutenant Harrison signed it with the tired efficiency of a man who understood that war was too complicated for paperwork, that the gap between what happened and what could be written was often wider than the canal itself. McNiece sat in the makeshift command post, a Dutch farmhouse that smelled of hay and fear, while Harrison's clerk typed the official version of events. The Bronze Star recommendation would follow within days, citing exceptional courage and devotion to duty in the execution of a critical demolition mission under extreme enemy pressure. The citation would be accurate as far as it went, but it would omit the trembling hands, the moment of panic, the accident that had saved them all. "You did good work out there, Sarge," Harrison said, pouring coffee from a battered pot that had seen too many command posts and too many dawns. "That bridge dropping when it did probably saved my entire company. Maybe the whole damn operation." McNiece nodded and accepted the coffee, feeling the warmth seep into fingers that had been numb since his plunge into the canal. Through the farmhouse windows, he could see German positions across the water gap, enemy engineers working methodically to restore the crossing. But those precious hours had allowed scattered companies to consolidate, ammunition to be redistributed, and defensive positions to be strengthened. Market Garden would ultimately stall short of its objectives, but the airborne corridor would hold long enough for Allied forces to establish permanent positions across the Dutch rivers. The strategic failure would be measured in miles not gained, bridges not captured, and objectives not achieved. But the tactical success would be counted in lives saved, positions held, and one more night survived by men who had learned to measure victory in smaller increments. Bowers appeared in the farmhouse doorway, his uniform still damp from the canal rescue, carrying news that would reshape how they remembered the night. "Sarge, we found the rest of the squad. They're alive, regrouped about 2 miles downstream. Sergeant Williams says they heard the explosion, and figured you'd handled the bridge situation in your usual style. McNiece smiled for the first time since the drop, thinking about the men who knew him well enough to interpret distant explosions as tactical success rather than disaster. The Filthy 13's reputation for unorthodox methods and spectacular results had been built on nights like this, when regulations met reality and improvisation filled the gap between what was planned and what was possible. But success carried its own weight. As word of the bridge demolition spread through the scattered companies of the 101st, the story would acquire details that hadn't existed, heroism that felt larger than the fear and confusion McNiece remembered. The legend would grow with each retelling, becoming cleaner, more purposeful, more deliberately heroic than the messy reality of water-damaged explosives and accidental timing. Years later, in American Legion halls and Veterans Administration hospitals, McNiece would hear versions of the story that bore only passing resemblance to his memories. The bridge would become larger, the enemy force more numerous, the demolition more precise and deliberately timed. He would listen to these embellishments with the quiet patience of a man who understood that people needed their heroes to be more intentional than circumstance usually allowed. The real weight wasn't in the medal recommendations or unit citations that would follow him through the war and beyond. It was in the knowledge that courage often looked like damaged equipment and impossible choices, that heroism was frequently indistinguishable from accident, and that the difference between legend and truth was usually measured in seconds of panic that no report could capture. 40 years after the war, McNiece would wake sometimes to the sound of freight trains crossing steel bridges in Oklahoma, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on girders carrying him back to a Dutch canal where a young paratrooper had stumbled into history. The nightmares had faded with time, but the weight remained, not guilt exactly, but the burden of carrying a truth too complicated for the clean narratives that democracy required from its heroes. The TNT satchel had done its job. The bridge had come down, and the 101st Airborne had survived another night in the long campaign to liberate Europe. But McNiece would always know that behind every medal and mission report there was a human being carrying memories that were heavier than bronze, more fragile than legend, and more honest than the stories that would outlive them all. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.